All they do is
So to me, Dead Rising has never been a franchise that has taken itself too seriously, kind of akin to what Saints Row does in terms of the gameplay that it offers. For the most part, you just have a lot of fun slaying legions upon legions of zombies in the most creative and destructive ways as possible, either through weapon crafting or vehicle slaughter. And that's fine. You take in the one-liners as they come through the story, and in general, you have the recipe for an overall fun experience, and that's all you can really ask for. However, I don't think I have ever played a video game that has taken a series a step back as much as Dead Rising 4 has for the Dead Rising franchise, especially when you compare it to Dead Rising 3 that came out a couple years ago. This is due to a slew of technical issues, as well as a whole bunch of questionable gameplay decisions that take away the main purpose of what the video game is supposed to offer. And what the video game is supposed to offer is fun. So I'm just going to gloss over the story really quickly because you don't play a Dead Rising game for the story. But for what it's worth, the story in Dead Rising 4, when you compare it to the other games in the series, actually is done fairly well. I actually enjoyed it. And I think this is mainly due to the fact that the character himself of Frank West and the writing and acting for Frank West was actually executed pretty well. It's actually leaps and bounds better than the majority of the characters that you're going to encounter throughout the entire game. So I actually dug it. So without diving into too many story spoilers, you're playing as Frank West once again, the original character from the original Dead Rising that came out in 2006, and he has returned to Willamette, the scene of the original game, and basically, for the most part, his motivations throughout the entire game is trying to avoid becoming what he views as a washed-up reporter, trying to stay relevant in the news, trying to avoid being one-upped by one of his students, and that's basically it. And I actually had a lot of, it was fun the entire way through following the story. It's coupled with a bunch of one-liners, some funny events, and you basically, take it for what it is. For a Dead Rising game, the story actually was not that bad.
Just hear me out.
You said we were gonna go play mini golf.
Respectfully, Professor, I can't actually believe you fell for that.
I love mini golf.
So Dead Rising 4 has always been a game that is just based on fun. You try to kill zombies as quickly and efficiently as you possibly can, but in Dead Rising 4 there are a lot of questionable gameplay decisions from previous games that have changed and basically make the game feel more like a chore and a slog to get through. In short, they take away from the fun and try to make the game kind of seem a little bit more realistic, which is something that the game should not do at all. So I'll start off with the weapon management system, and at the very beginning of the game, you automatically feel that you are somewhat restricted in the amount of items that you could carry. You cannot carry nearly as much as you want throughout the entire game. And yes, you can invest some skill points into the skill tree to be able to carry a little bit more. However, by the time you actually reach a point in the game where you actually feel that you can carry as much as you possibly want, you're already at the end of the game, and the game is pretty much over. So you spend the majority of the game kind of just hoarding the items and weapons that you know will be effective, the most effective. And this is added to the fact that the weapons now have a durability system. So after a couple of uses, a set amount of time of uses, the weapon eventually just breaks down and you cannot use it anymore. So what this does, coupled with the fact that you can't carry nearly as much as you want, you tend to lean on specific weapons that you know are the most effective. Just like any other video game out there, some items are more effective than others, but the fact that they break down and the fact that you can't carry nearly as much as you possibly want, like I said, you tend to lean on typical weapons that you know will be the most effective in trying to destroy as many zombies as possible. So one of the new gameplay elements that I actually quite enjoyed a lot was the introduction of the exosuit, which was definitely the most fun that I had throughout the entire game. So inside the exosuit, which you can either find in the free roam world or during a lot of times during main missions, Frank gains a ton of new abilities such as the ability to infinitely sprint. Personally myself, I think that the base Frank should have been able to infinitely sprint because it just once again takes away from the fun, but we'll get back to that a little bit later. He can start wielding a bunch of new weapons such as a flamethrower, a minigun. He has the strength to pull out a parking meter straight out of the ground and start whacking zombies with it. And especially when you get into some upgrades for the power suits, such as a vacuum cleaner or a slushy machine, or just basically some Iron Man-like arsenals that you can pick up in the free world. However, much like a lot of the other gameplay choices there are some caveats that, once again, take away from the fun of being inside an exosuit. First off, when you find an exosuit in the free roam world, it will have a counter at the very bottom left hand corner of the screen, which basically acts as a battery for the exosuit, so you have a set amount of time in it, so you can't stay in it infinitely, which I understand why they did it. However, I think they should, well, instead of just adding a counter, they should just made it so Frank can't do certain actions, which basically what they did is inside the exosuit you can't ride vehicles, which I understand why, because if you're inside this high mechanized power suit, you shouldn't be able to ride a vehicle just because it's so bulky. That made sense to me, but if I want to stay in the exosuit as long as I possibly can, I think I should be able to, and that's personally my opinion. And as well, there's other limitations as well. You can't access normal weapons, which doesn't make any sense to me. So if there are some normal weapons that you want to try out, you don't have access to it. You have to use the normal exosuit only weapons, such as the battle axe, the flamethrower, the minigun weapons that I mentioned earlier. And that doesn't make sense to me. If you're in an exosuit, why can't you use weapons that you constructed in the real world? And once again, it's just taking away from the fun of the game, in my personal opinion. It doesn't make really much sense to me. And just quickly, while I'm on the topic of weapons, so the melee weapons in Dead Rising games have always felt good, and they do feel good in Dead Rising 4. The grenade and projectile options feel as good as they should be. However, the firearm in the third-person shooting is definitely some of the worst shooting mechanics that I have ever played in a modern-day video game. It just feels very clumsy. It feels very clunky and just does not feel good to use at all, which is probably why I deferred mostly just to melee weapons when I played the game. And finishing off talking about the gameplay, probably my biggest complaint is about the mission structures. So don't get me wrong, the killing zombies and hordes of zombies feels just as good in Dead Rising 4 as it has in previous games, but in the previous games the mission structure felt definitely a lot more varied, even though at the base you're probably doing the exact same thing. And I'll give you an example. So the psychopath system. So in Dead Rising 3, you probably remember there were a bunch of unique bosses, either through side missions or main missions, and there were unique enemies called psychopaths. In previous games, the psychopaths definitely had their distinct flavor and feel to them. They had unique attacks, unique movement patterns, and each encounter was really memorable. In this game, from what I have played, diving into the side quests as well on my off time, the psychopaths weren't really unique. They were, in most cases, basically just normal human beings who were just wearing costumes, and they just typically attack like normal humans do. And for the boss encounters that you face in the game, for the most part, the majority of them are just basically gigantic bullet sponges, and they don't really offer anything unique in terms of different gameplay or attack patterns. And it's probably, it didn't make any of the scenes feel special, especially when you ran into the boss. You kind of just basically, yeah, just hit this guy as quickly as much as you possibly want through the weapons that you have available, and you can basically literally just pummel a person into oblivion with a specific melee weapon, and they really won't change their movement patterns at all, and don't offer in terms of anything different in terms of gameplay. It wasn't fun facing a psychopath. In previous games, it was definitely, when you encountered a psychopath, you felt like there was going to be an event that's about to happen, and it was going to be fun fighting this person, and it just didn't happen in Dead Rising 4 at all. I'll be honest with you, when I played my early demos of this game on a technical level, I was actually really concerned about the full release of this game. When I played previous demos of the game earlier in the year, I found that the game suffered from a lot of frame rate issues on Xbox, especially when you got more zombies on the screen at once. But I do not know what voodoo the Capcom whipped up in the last couple months, because I actually really didn't notice that many frame rate dips throughout my entire playthrough, and that's something that is commendable, because I'm to this day, I'm really astounded by the amount of zombies they can fit on the screen all at once, and still to this day, killing a zombie just feels as good as it did during the original Dead Rising that came out over 11 years ago. It just feels great to kill a zombie in this game. It feels very smooth and refreshing. No matter how many times you do it, it just feels great the entire way through. However, there are still some technical hitches in terms of your character melting into some textures, such as vehicles or a wall or stuff like that. And I did run into a couple of times where the game once froze just completely just froze and stopped working. As well, the game crashed just once, which isn't too bad in the playthrough of an entire game. A game crashing in modern gaming anyways, a game crashing only twice through an entire playthrough actually is not that bad, but it's still worth mentioning in my opinion. However, the sound design and the technical sound issues of this game is probably some of the worst sound that I've ever played in a video game, especially when you're talking about character dialogue. So as you're moving around, especially if you're playing with headphones, you'll really notice this, that at one moment you're talking to a character, he'll be super quiet, and it'll change to him feeling like he's super far in the distance, and it'll change immediately to it feeling like he's yelling directly in your ear. So definitely in terms of voice acting, probably some of the worst sound design that I have ever encountered in the video game. And as well, just general movements and felt somewhat clunky, such as being able to pick up an item felt a lot more difficult than it should, and picking up and dropping weapons should definitely feel good in a Dead Rising game. It shouldn't feel like it is off like it did in this game. And sometimes when you drop a weapon, it will just straight up disappear beneath your feet. And just wrapping up quickly with the topic of graphics, I am not going to go too far in depth into this and give you guys screenshot comparisons and go super in deep with the conversations of this many poly counts and all that. But simply put, this game looks worse than Dead Rising 3 did. Dead Rising 3 graphically was a better looking game in terms of its character models, its open world, the diversity of the environments. It just looked better. There are a lot of sections of this game, such as the shelters, that are literally just cut and paste. Every shelter in this game looks exactly the same in terms of its layout. So once again, kind of just somewhat lazy game design. And in general, the world in Dead Rising 3 just felt better. It looked more unique. So overall, as a video game, Dead Rising 4 will offer some small moments of enjoyability. It will not, in the long run, satisfy long-term veterans of the series or try to attract any sort of newcomers as well. If you are a long-term veteran of the series and have played every single game or the majority of the games in the past, especially with Dead Rising 3, you'll notice that Dead Rising 4 has taken a definite step back in terms of graphics and technical issues, as well as gameplay, which has basically made the game feel less fun to play, which is probably the biggest knock of Dead Rising 4. It just generally feels less fun to play than previous games in the series. And as well, if you are a newcomer to the series and are thinking of jumping into it, I probably would rather recommend you play Dead Rising 3 because it is by far a far more enjoyable game to play. And yeah, it is what it is. I would not recommend that you pick up this game at full price. If anything, probably if you get a chance, pick it up in a couple months, where most likely will be at the bottom of a bargain bin somewhere in your local store.